Good evening, dear listener. I'm glad you've joined me tonight. Settle yourself in, perhaps with a pillow tucked just right beneath your head, or a favorite blanket pulled softly around your shoulders. Wherever you are, whether by a quiet lamp, beside the hum of a fan, or with the window open to welcome the night breeze, let yourself feel safe and unhurried. Tonight we travel together, not to a land of make-believe, but to a place once very real, ancient Athens. You may have seen it in history books as marble columns and heroic statues, but the truth of daily life was softer, harsher, and far more human. Tonight's story is not about philosophers debating beneath olive trees. It is about ordinary people, fetching water, grinding grain, tending wounds, sharing bread. It is about what it meant to survive and to hope when the world was fragile and uncertain. If this gentle journey speaks to you, I invite you to pause and touch the small heart icon, to subscribe so you'll always have these night stories waiting when you need them. And, if you'd like, leave a quiet note telling us where you're listening from. I've heard from friends in Canada and California, even from a woman who listens each night in the soft dark of Maine. Your presence here matters. So now, dim the lights if you can. Take one slow, steady breath. Imagine the flicker of a hearth, the murmur of voices long ago, and the press of narrow city streets. Let us step quietly into Athens and into part one of our journey. A quiet wish stirred in every Athenian heart. It begins, not with trumpets or bright banners, but with the hushed breath of ordinary people in a city already ancient to us. Each household, each family, carried a wish, though few said it aloud. It was not a wish for wealth, nor fame, nor the grand speeches carved into stone. It was a humbler, more urgent longing, a wish for safety, for bread on the table tomorrow, for a child's laughter to continue past the age of 5, for a husband or brother to return from war with both legs beneath him and breath still in his chest. The Athenians of that golden age, so often praised for their wisdom and beauty, lived in rooms that smelled of smoke and damp clay. Mothers swept ash from their doorways in the morning, while their children coughed quietly in the shadows. Fathers bent their backs to trades that wore them down faster than years could. And above them all, the city itself shimmered, marble on the Acropolis catching the sun, a reminder that while the city might flourish, the lives inside it remained fragile. If you had walked their streets before dawn, you would have seen the first signs of that hidden longing. A woman clutching a clay jar, hurrying to the public fountain, hoping to reach it before the crowds pressed in. A potter's apprentice rubbing sore hands, already raw from the stone wheel, whispering to himself that today might bring fewer mistakes, fewer angry words from his master. A boy squinting at the horizon, wondering whether smoke there meant breakfast fires or distant war. No one spoke of these hopes openly. To speak them was to invite disappointment. Better to carry them silently, folded into the body, like a prayer whispered without words. But if you looked closely into the eyes of those Athenians, you would have seen it. A flicker of yearning, fragile yet persistent, the way a candle keeps burning even in a drafty room. There was always danger near. The city was ringed by its great walls, meant to keep Spartan spears at bay, yet those same walls trapped sickness and foul air. Children played barefoot in narrow alleys, laughing, though their laughter was thinned by hunger. Men gathered in the agora, their talk a mixture of trade and rumor, as if one could not be told without the other. And always, behind the chatter, there was the steady drumbeat of fear. The war might press closer, the harvest might fail, the wells might poison. And so each person kept their wish quietly. A mother stroking her baby's hair as it nursed, wishing only that fever would not steal this one, as it had another. An old man in a corner workshop, wishing for one more season before his lungs gave out. A girl threading wool in the half-light, wishing that when she married, her husband would not be cruel. Ordinary wishes, born of hardship, bound together like threads in a loom. These were not the kind of wishes that made it into epic poetry. No bard sang of them, no temple carved them in marble. Yet they were real, perhaps more real than all the stories of heroes. They were the breath that kept Athens alive, even as wars raged and philosophers dreamed. Imagine, if you will, lying down in that world. The floor beneath you is hard, the mattress thin, the smoke still stings your eyes. Yet even as your back aches, you think of tomorrow, and in your chest, you keep that secret ember, a hope that morning will come again, with water at the fountain, bread on the board, and loved ones safe beside you. This was the hidden wish carried by every heart in Athens, and it is here, in this quiet, unspoken longing, that our journey begins. Athens stirred to smoky dawn routines. The night fades slowly in a city without clocks. In Athens, the first measure of time is not the ticking of gears or the buzz of alarms, but the gradual shift of light in narrow streets, the soft call of roosters from hidden courtyards, the shuffle of sandals against stone. Dawn creeps in like a shy guest, and with it, households stir to life. Imagine the air inside a small mud brick home, still heavy with the smoke of last night's fire. The coals glow faintly in the hearth, and someone rises before the others to coax them back to flame. She blows gently through a hollow reed, the sparks leaping, the smoke swirling anew. The smell is sharp, acrid, clinging to hair and cloth, yet it is the smell of life itself. Without fire, there is no bread, no warmth, no protection from the shadows. In the dim corner, a child coughs and rolls over, pulling a rough blanket closer. Beside him, his sister stirs. She has learned, even at 8, that mornings begin not with comfort, but with tasks. She stretches her small arms, rubs sleep from her eyes, and reaches for the clay jar waiting by the door. Water must be fetched before the streets crowd, before the sun climbs too high. She knows the path to the fountain better than the lines on her palm. Her mother follows, wrapping her himation tightly around her shoulders, and together they step into the cool dawn. The streets are narrow, pressed between walls of mud brick and timber. Shadows linger in corners, but already other figures emerge. Neighbors balancing jars, slaves carrying burdens, older men on their way to the marketplace. Voices are hushed at this hour, yet the city hums with anticipation. The fountain lies at the end of a crooked lane, a stone basin fed by clay pipes that reach beyond the city walls. The water gurgles faintly, uneven, as if reluctant to be drawn. Women line up patiently, each balancing her jar, each greeting the others with small nods or murmured words. The air smells of damp stone, mingled with the faint sweetness of figs from a nearby stall being arranged for the day. A girl drops her jar, and it cracks sharply against the pavement. The sound startles those nearby, and for a moment all eyes turn. She gasps, pressing her hands to her mouth. The jar was heavy, costly, perhaps more than her family could spare to replace. A neighbor steps forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, murmuring that perhaps the potter near the agora will mend it. The girl nods quickly, holding back tears, while others shift uneasily, reminded of how fragile every possession is. In a world where wealth is measured in goats, olives, or jars of clay, one accident can carry the weight of tragedy. Back in the home, the potter himself rises. His name is not preserved in any inscription, but we might call him Diocles, as others have. He stretches his shoulders, already stiff with the memory of yesterday's work. His hands are broad, calloused, his lungs heavy from years of breathing dust. He steps into the small workshop attached to his house, where lumps of clay wait in shallow vats. He kneels, pressing his feet into the damp mixture, kneading it rhythmically, his toes blackened by the soil that will soon become vessels for oil, wine, and grain. Above the rooftops, the first rays of sunlight catch the limestone of the Acropolis. For a brief moment, the city gleams, white and golden, as though the gods themselves have brushed their fingers over it. But the beauty is fleeting. Below, in the twisting streets, reality is harsher. Smoke lingers. The stench of refuse rises from corners. Dogs bark. A child trips over a loose stone and cries. And still the work continues, because in Athens, as in any city, survival does not wait. Breakfast, when it comes, is meager. Barley bread, dense and coarse, torn by hand and dipped into watered wine. Sometimes a handful of olives, sometimes a crumble of goat cheese if fortune is kind. No one complains, for hunger is constant and expectation modest. A child chews slowly, eyes half closed with sleep, and his mother brushes crumbs from his lips. The family bows briefly toward the household shrine, offering a drop of wine to unseen powers, before rising again to their tasks. The streets brighten now, filled with the noise of morning trade. Vendors call out the freshness of their figs, their fish, their herbs. A butcher slaps his hand against a slab of meat, assuring passers-by that it was slaughtered only yesterday, though the smell suggests otherwise. A slave haggles for grain, his master's coins clutched tightly in his hand. A neighbor pauses to share the latest rumor. Spartan troops spotted near the border, or perhaps it was only travelers. No one knows for sure. Children dart between the stalls, chasing each other with a pig's bladder blown into a ball. Their laughter rings clear, cutting through the grumble of voices, though their bare feet splash through puddles of waste. They are thin, some with bellies distended by worms, yet they run with the same energy as children everywhere, their games carrying them through hardship like sails, catching a stray wind. By mid-morning, the sun climbs high enough to warm the stones. Shadows shorten, and the city takes on its full shape. Walls looming, rooftops crowded, temples gleaming in the distance. Citizens gather in clusters, discussing politics with urgency. Women hurry with baskets of wool or jars of water. Slaves rush past with messages, their eyes downcast. And always the undercurrent of struggle persists. The knowledge that one mistake, one illness, one unlucky twist could alter everything. Inside the potter's workshop, the wheel begins to spin. Clay rises beneath his hands, wobbling, then steadying. His apprentice watches closely, eager to learn, though his own attempts have left shards piled in the corner. The room is hot, filled with the smell of damp earth and smoke from the kiln. Rats scurry along the wall, bold enough to steal scraps left behind. The potter sighs, wiping his brow, yet continues, shaping vessel after vessel, his hands guided by years of practice, his body weary but unyielding. Above the noise, a temple bell rings faintly. It is not a clock, not a schedule, but a reminder. The gods are near, and they must be honored. A woman pauses at her doorway, lifting her hands briefly to the sky. A boy tosses a crumb toward the household shrine. Even amid hunger, even amid dust and sweat, reverence threads through the day like a quiet melody. As the sun climbs higher still, the air thickens. Heat presses down, and people retreat where they can, into shaded courtyards, beneath awnings, into cool corners of stone. The streets quiet slightly, though the flies do not rest. A dog sleeps in the dust, ears twitching at every sound. Somewhere, a man coughs deeply, the sound echoing against the walls. No one lingers too long to notice. Illness is part of life, as common as bread, as persistent as smoke. This is Athens at first light, a city both radiant and weary, filled with beauty glimpsed in marble and misery carried in jars of water and loaves of bread. It is not the paradise carved into our imagination, nor the hell feared in whispers, but something in between. A place where survival itself is a kind of triumph, repeated each dawn, fragile as the flame coaxed from last night's embers. Heavy jars shaped the rhythm of survival. The story of water in Athens is not told in rivers or fountains alone, but in the bent backs and tired arms of those who carried it. Before the sun had climbed too high, before the marketplace filled with shouting vendors and impatient citizens, women and children, and sometimes servants like you, made their way to the public wells. It was a ritual as old as the city itself, an everyday pilgrimage upon which life depended. Imagine stepping into the street at dawn with a clay amphora pressed against your shoulder. The jar itself weighs enough to trouble your muscles, even before it's filled. Once brimming with water, it is a burden of nearly 50 pounds. The task is not heroic. No poet will sing of it. Yet every household depends on these journeys. Bread cannot be made, clay cannot be mixed, wounds cannot be washed, without water fetched in the sweat of human bodies. The streets are uneven, paved only in places, strewn with stones and refuse. A single misstep could crack the vessel in your arms, spilling its contents into the dust and costing your family dearly. That is why, even in the hush of morning, the women step carefully, their faces set in concentration, their bodies swaying slightly with the rhythm of the jars they carry. They know the path, they know the dangers. Their hands are calloused, their arms strong, their balance precise, honed by years of necessity. At the fountain, the air is filled with the sound of dripping water, the chatter of voices, and the occasional cry of a child tugging at his mother's robe. The line forms early, for everyone fears the crowd that comes later. Each person waits patiently, the jars arranged neatly in front of them, like soldiers awaiting their turn. There is gossip here, but also knowledge, whispered warnings about which fountain runs too cloudy, which one smells faintly of rot, which cousin or neighbor fell ill after drinking from the wrong place. The fountain water itself glimmers in the morning light, deceptively clear. It carries not just refreshment, but risk, for the unseen world of parasites and disease is always present. No one here speaks of bacteria. They have no such words, but they know enough to fear fevers that come suddenly, bellies that swell painfully, skin that turns yellow before death. They know enough to mistrust water that smells of leather from the nearby tannery, or of ash from a workshop's drain. Knowledge is passed not in books, but in warnings spoken softly as jars are filled. A young woman named Thea steps beside you, her hands steady as she lowers her vessel into the flow. She notices your clumsy grip, the way the jar wobbles dangerously, and smiles faintly. "Not from here," she says. You murmur something vague, and she accepts it. Without judgment, she shows you how to tip the vessel, how to balance the weight so the water runs smoothly, filling without spilling. She warns you of a fountain near the edge of the leatherworkers' quarter. "My cousin drank there once," she says quietly. "Fever took her in 3 days. Black bile, yellow skin. We knew it was the water. The words land softly but heavily, like a stone dropped into still water. Here, death is not distant. It sits quietly in the queue beside you, in the whispers of neighbors, in the memory of those lost. You lift your jar with both arms, feeling the strain immediately. The muscles in your shoulders burn, your palms slip slightly against the clay. Thea glances at you again, but says nothing. She knows you will either learn or fail. Survival here is not a matter of pity, but of adaptation. The walk home feels endless. The streets tilt and twist. The stones catch at your sandals. The jar presses painfully into your side. At one corner, a chamber pot is emptied suddenly from an upper window, splashing into the dust only a few steps away. You stumble, nearly dropping the amphora, but catch yourself in time. An old man, stooped and coughing, watches with a grin. "First time in Athens," he rasps. "You'll get used to the smell, or you won't. Either way, you won't mind for long." He shuffles away, leaving only the echo of his laugh. By the time you reach the doorway of your house, your arms are trembling, your back slick with sweat. You set the jar down carefully, your breath ragged, your palms raw from gripping the clay. Lydia, the potter's wife, nods once, unsmiling, and moves to pour some of the precious water into a basin. She does not praise you. She does not thank you. In this world, bringing water is not kindness, but obligation. Without it, nothing else is possible. Inside, the water is measured carefully. Some for cooking, some for washing, a small portion for drinking. None wasted. Every drop has cost muscle and time, and will cost them again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. It is a rhythm of survival, repeated endlessly, unchanging as the sun itself. Later, as the morning unfolds, you watch as a small boy carries a jar half his size, stumbling under its weight. His mother walks beside him, her hand steadying his back. He is only 7, but he must learn, because soon enough he will be expected to carry his share without help. Childhood here is brief. There are no toys waiting at home, no hours free for play, only tasks to be mastered and burdens to be borne. In the distance, a shout rises. Someone has slipped. A jar has shattered. The sound of clay breaking is sharp, final, like the snap of bone. A crowd gathers briefly, then disperses. There is no time for sympathy. Everyone has their own vessel to guard, their own water to protect. The broken jar is left by the roadside, shards glinting in the sun, a reminder of how thin the line between survival and loss can be. By midday, the fountains are crowded, the heat oppressive. Those who come later wait in long lines, the sun beating down, the air filled with the smells of sweat, smoke, and refuse. Tempers flare, voices rise. Yet the water must be fetched, no matter the discomfort. A family without water will not eat, will not wash, will not live. And so the jars keep moving, back and forth, carried on tired shoulders, clutched in aching hands, their weight shaping the rhythm of every life in the city. It is easy, from our modern distance, to overlook the simple act of carrying water. We turn a tap, fill a glass, and think no more of it. But in Athens, it was a test faced daily, a trial of endurance repeated endlessly, a reminder that survival rested not on ideals carved in marble, but on muscles straining against clay. The philosophers could speak of truth and virtue. The statesmen could argue about war and democracy. But none of it mattered without water in the jar, carried carefully through the streets by hands that knew both hardship and hope. And so, as the day wears on, and the jars stand in their places within each home, glimmering faintly in the dim light, they are more than containers. They are symbols of labor, of fragility, of life itself, pressed into clay and borne on human shoulders. Each vessel carries not just water, but the weight of survival. Unseen burdens pressed quietly on every life. Athens, in its so-called golden age, is remembered for shining temples, for words carved in stone, for voices echoing in the assembly. Yet beneath those marble facades lay quieter truths, truths that seldom made their way into histories or poems. They were the barriers no one announced, the struggles carried in silence, like stones in the pocket or shadows across the floor. The first of these barriers was the body itself. Few Athenians lived past what we would call middle age. Children slipped away often, their laughter cut short by fever or cough. Women bore child after child, hoping that some would survive, their own bodies worn down in the process. Men grew stooped early, their lungs clogged by dust, their joints stiff with years of labor. Pain was constant, accepted like weather, spoken of only when it became unbearable, endured quietly otherwise. In the potter's household, you see it in Lydia's hands, the skin cracked and rough from grinding grain. She moves with the rhythm of habit, not complaint, because complaint would change nothing. You hear it in the cough of Diocles, the potter himself, each breath rasping from years at the wheel, shaping clay while dust swirled endlessly in his lungs. You see it in the stoop of an old neighbor who once labored in the silver mines, his back twisted into a permanent bow. None of these burdens were announced or recorded. They were carried silently, day after day, until they grew too heavy, and then the body gave way. The second barrier was the air. Smoke lingered in every home. Fires burned for cooking, for warmth, for light, but never quite escaped through the roof holes meant to release them. The smell clung to hair, to cloth, to skin. Children grew up breathing it, their lungs accustomed to the sting, their eyes watering, their throats burning. It was a barrier invisible but ever present, a haze between every breath and comfort. The third was the city itself. Its walls, built high to guard against Spartan spears, also trapped foulness inside. There was no system to carry waste away. Chamber pots were emptied into the street with only a warning shout. Dogs prowled, pigs rooted, flies swarmed. The stench pressed down on every nose, so constant that Athenians scarcely noticed anymore. But you, arriving from another time, find it nearly unbearable. You gag at the sharp smell of urine, at the sour reek of rotting scraps in the gutter, at the rank odor of unwashed bodies passing too close. To the Athenians, these smells were as ordinary as the sun. To you, they are a barrier of their own, an invisible wall separating then from now. There were barriers, too, of status. Who you were, where you came from, determined everything. Citizens, a small fraction of the city's people, walked with confidence, their rights secure. Women, even citizen women, lived in the shadows, their roles confined to household and children. Foreigners were tolerated but marked, never fully belonging, always suspect. Slaves, who made up nearly a third of Athens, had no rights at all. Their lives were counted in labor, their names often forgotten. And you, standing in this household as an outsider, feel the press of that hierarchy at every turn. You are useful, yes, but usefulness is fragile. A mistake could strip even that away. Religion, too, though it bound the community, could be a barrier. The gods were everywhere, in the corner shrines, in the marketplace, in the words spoken before every meal. Offerings were required, sacrifices demanded. Forget or fail, and you risked not only divine displeasure, but the judgment of neighbors. To live in Athens was to live beneath countless eyes, human and divine alike. Privacy was rare. Conformity was survival. The barrier was not just belief, but expectation, woven into every gesture of the day. And then there was the greatest silent barrier of all: uncertainty. Illness arrived without warning, its cause unknowable. Crops failed, ships sank, wars erupted. News traveled slowly, shaped by rumor and hearsay. A neighbor might whisper of sickness at the port, or of Spartan movements nearby, but the truth would not be known for days, sometimes weeks. Decisions had to be made in fog, guided not by knowledge but by instinct, by tradition, by the counsel of those nearest. To live with such uncertainty was to live with constant unease, a shadow that never lifted fully, a barrier that could not be breached. Still, Athenians endured. They carried their silent burdens not with triumph, but with quiet persistence. A mother who had lost 2 children brushed her surviving daughter's hair as gently as if to protect her from every danger in the world. A craftsman whose lungs rattled with every breath still bent to shape clay at his wheel. A soldier who feared the coming battle sharpened his spear and joked with his friends as though courage could be forged out of laughter. None of these people will be remembered in marble. Their names will not echo through centuries. Yet their lives, pressed against these silent barriers, were as real and as precious as any statesman's speech or poet's verse. They woke each morning, carried their water, baked their bread, worked their trades, and hoped, quietly, fiercely, to see another dawn. Perhaps, as you listen now in the quiet of your room, you can feel something of their world pressing in. The weight of smoke in the air, the ache of tired muscles, the sting of a cough that will not heal, the uncertainty of what tomorrow brings. These were the barriers they knew, carried not in shouts or proclamations, but in silence. And yet, in that silence, life continued. Children still played, neighbors still gossiped, lovers still met in shadowed corners, and the city, for all its hardship, still rose to greet the sun. Another story reflects your own hidden fears. In the midst of a city teeming with voices, with merchants shouting and sandals scraping, with children darting between stalls and soldiers moving with iron at their sides, there is always the quiet figure who slips past unnoticed. He does not command the attention of statesmen or the reverence of priests, yet his presence lingers in memory. To meet him is to glimpse something of yourself, a reflection not polished in marble, but softened in shadow. You first see him at the fountain, his back bent in a way that suggests both age and labor. He stands with a jar smaller than the others, his hands trembling slightly as he lowers it to the water. His tunic is patched at the shoulder, his sandals worn nearly through. No one pays him much mind, and yet you cannot look away. There is something in his posture, in the careful way he steadies the clay, that tells a longer story than words could. When his jar is filled, he lingers a moment longer, as though reluctant to begin the heavy walk home. His eyes flicker across the faces around him, settling briefly on yours. For an instant, you feel as though he has recognized you. Not your name, not your origin, but something deeper. Recognition without detail, a silent acknowledgement that you too carry burdens unseen. Later, you encounter him again, this time at the market. He leans on a staff, watching the crowd with weary patience. A fishmonger calls out, lifting a silver-scaled catch for all to see, but the man only shakes his head. He has no coins for such luxuries. Instead, he waits until the shouting has softened, until the scraps are offered, the smaller fish, the ones beginning to dull in the heat. He gathers them quietly, slipping them into a woven bag. No pride, no shame, only the quiet persistence of someone who knows the rhythm of scarcity. Someone whispers his name, Timon, son of no one important. A potter once, they say, before his hands grew too stiff to shape the clay. Now he helps where he can, arranging vessels, mending cracks, carrying what little weight his body still allows. His life has narrowed, but it has not ended. He remains part of the household, still useful, still present. One evening, you find yourself beside him in the workshop, the light dimming as lamps flicker. He arranges pots on shelves with slow, deliberate care. His fingers, twisted though they are, still move with precision. Stack them wrong, he says softly, and they crack. Simple as that. His voice is calm, but behind the words lies a truth deeper than pottery. Survival itself is like these vessels, fragile, dependent on careful placement, easily broken if neglected. He does not ask you where you come from, though perhaps he suspects you are not like the others. Instead, he offers fragments of memory, pieces of a life lived through wars and seasons. I saw the Persians once, he murmurs, his eyes distant. Their ships lined the horizon like a wall of iron. We thought we would be crushed, but we endured. Always we endure, though not all of us. He pauses, his gaze heavy with things he does not say. Golden age, they call it. Gold for some, perhaps, for others only clay. In his words, you hear echoes of your own quiet fears, of fragility, of endings, of the ways history praises marble while forgetting flesh. His cough interrupts the silence, rattling deep in his chest, a reminder of dust long breathed, of smoke inhaled day after day. He waves it off, but you see the truth. Each breath is work, each word a labor. The next morning, you glimpse him again, seated near the shrine in the household corner. He pours a drop of wine with hands that shake, whispering a prayer too faint to hear. The gods may or may not listen, but the act itself carries meaning, not in its grandeur, but in its constancy. It is his way of placing himself, however small, within the fabric of the city, within the flow of time. And so he becomes, for you, a kind of mirror. He is not heroic, not exceptional. He is ordinary, deeply so. And yet, in his ordinariness lies something profound. He reminds you that survival is not a matter of triumph, but of persistence. That worth is not measured in gold or marble, but in the quiet care of arranging vessels, of carrying water, of whispering prayers in the dark. Perhaps, as you listen now, you recognize yourself in him, the way he endures with quiet dignity, the way he accepts fragility yet continues, the way he finds meaning not in greatness, but in small, steady acts. In Athens, he is one among thousands, but to you, he becomes a reflection, a reminder that history is not only the story of those who stood in assemblies or carved their names into stone, but also of those who carried jars, stacked pots, whispered prayers, and endured. Gentle kindness softened even the hardest hours. It is easy, standing in the noise of Athens, to believe that survival depended only on muscle, on coin, on the patronage of those higher in rank. Yet beneath that harsh surface, another force quietly wove its way through daily life: kindness. It did not thunder like speeches in the assembly, nor gleam like marble upon the Acropolis. It was smaller, almost hidden, a loaf shared, a word spoken softly, a hand extended just when one was about to fall. On your third morning in the potter's house, The air is heavy with dust. The grinding stone waits. The clay demands mixing. Lydia moves briskly, her sleeves rolled up, her face set in its usual mask of endurance. Yet when she sees the blisters on your palms, swollen and raw from the previous day's labor, she pauses. Without a word, she tears a strip from an old tunic, presses it into your hand. "Wrap them," she says simply. The cloth is coarse, but it keeps the clay from biting further. It is not pity, not softness. It is a recognition. One cannot shape pots with hands too broken. Her gesture, though practical, carries warmth. It is the smallest form of mercy, and yet it changes the rhythm of the day. Later, Melina, her daughter, passes you a little crust of bread while the others are still working. She smiles shyly as you chew. "You look hungry," she whispers. "Father says the strong must eat more." The bread is stale, but the kindness is fresh, and in that moment, you feel less like a stranger, more like one of them. The girl's hands, stained with pigment from painting pottery designs, move quickly back to her work, but her gift lingers in your thoughts. At the market, you see another act. A woman with 2 children stands hesitating by a vendor's stall. She has only a few small coins, not enough for the bread she hopes for. The vendor shakes his head, impatient. But a neighbor, standing behind her, presses a fig into the woman's hand, pretending not to notice when she tries to thank him. The woman's children bite into the fruit, juice running down their chins, their laughter rising above the clamor. No record will ever mention that fig, but for those children, it was life itself. Athens was filled with shadows, disease, poverty, war pressing close. Yet within those shadows, kindness lit its small lamps. A soldier carrying a wounded comrade back from the line. A neighbor lending a pot, knowing it might never be returned. A healer offering herbs freely when a family could not pay. Such acts did not erase hardship, but they softened its edges, making the unbearable just a little less so. Even in the workshop, where competition and scarcity often bred hostility, you find unexpected kindness. Alexios, the senior apprentice who sneered at your clumsiness on the first day, notices you struggling with the heavy vat of clay. For a long moment he watches, expression unreadable. Then, with a grunt, he lifts the other side, helping you pour without spilling. He does not look at you, does not speak, but his action speaks louder than any word. Later, as the day closes, he mutters almost to himself, "Don't drop the next one." In Athens, that is praise enough. These acts, small as they are, remind you that humanity survives not only on strength, but on tenderness. In a city where war can empty households overnight, where plague can sweep through streets without warning, kindness becomes a form of resistance. It is how people declare that hardship will not strip them of their gentler selves. And you, lying awake that night on your rough pallet, feel the memory of those gestures like a quilt. Lydia's cloth against your blistered hands, Melina's bread, Alexios's silent strength. Each is small, fleeting, forgotten by most. But to you, they form a pattern, a key, one that unlocks not doors of wood or stone, but the heart's resilience. For in truth, survival in ancient Athens was never a solitary act. It was always collective, built from threads of connection, of obligation, and of mercy. No one lived long without the help of others, and those who gave help freely carved out a quiet kind of immortality in the lives they touched. So when you recall Athens, not the marble, not the speeches, but the lives, remember also the fig pressed into a mother's hand, the cloth wrapped around blisters, the girl's shy smile as she shared her crust of bread. They were the real keys that turned the locks of despair and kept life moving, one day after another. a silent turn reveals how fragile life truly was. It happens without fanfare, without the roar of armies or the thunder of gods. It begins in a whisper, in a tremor unnoticed by most, and yet it changes the atmosphere of the entire household. Such shocks in Athens did not always come with blood on the street or fire on the horizon. Often they arrived in the stillness of an ordinary day, when the familiar rhythm faltered just slightly, and everyone, without admitting it, felt the shadow fall. The morning begins much like any other. Lydia is at the grinding stone, her shoulders moving in a steady rhythm. Diocles bends over the wheel, shaping clay with hands that seem to know every contour without needing sight. Alexios carries wood for the kiln. Melina hums softly as she mixes pigments. Even you, still learning the pace of this life, feel lulled by the repetition. There is comfort in routine, even in hardship. But comfort can be deceptive. It is Theon, Lydia's brother, the soldier who returned limping from the battlefield, who changes the day. He has been recovering slowly, his leg wound wrapped and tended with herbs, his fever long broken. The household has begun to breathe easier, trusting that his survival is secured. He moves with more confidence now, leaning on a staff, offering to help with tasks beyond his strength. He jokes again, even laughs, though a shadow lingers behind his eyes. Then, as he bends to lift a pot from the low shelf, he gasps. It is not a shout, not even loud enough to stop the wheels spinning. Only a sharp breath, followed by the dull thud of clay slipping from his hands. The vessel shatters on the floor, shards scattering like dry leaves. For an instant, silence falls. Then Lydia is at his side, her hands steady but her face taut. Theon grips his thigh, where the wound had seemed clean. Now, through the linen, you see the stain spreading, dark, too fast. Infection, though the word belongs to your world more than theirs. To them it is the rot, the silent enemy that returns when you think you have won. Theon's face is pale, his breath shallow. Just slipped, he mutters, but his eyes betray him. He knows. They all know. The household adjusts swiftly, as if rehearsed by centuries of similar moments. Melina fetches fresh cloth. Lydia heats wine to pour over the wound. Alexios sweeps away the shards in silence, though his jaw is tight. Even Diocles, normally so consumed by the wheel, sets aside his work and kneels beside his brother-in-law. No one panics, because panic is useless here. Yet the air has changed. Every breath feels heavier. Through the day, Theon drifts in and out of strength. At times he sits upright, speaking of the war, of comrades still out there on the line. At times he slumps, his words tangled, his eyes glassy. The infection has slipped into his blood. You know it with the certainty of modern knowledge, but to them, it is the balance of humors, a misalignment of forces within his body, perhaps worsened by some displeasure of the gods. They do all they can, with herbs, with bandages, with prayers at the shrine. Yet you feel how fragile it is, how easily one life can tip from promise into peril. In the evening, neighbors gather. They come not with noise, but with quiet offerings. A sprig of rosemary, said to draw out sickness. A strip of honeycomb, meant to soothe fever. A small figurine of Asclepius, placed gently near Theon's bed. They murmur words of comfort, though their eyes scan his face for signs of which way the balance leans. You can see the truth in their posture. Each has stood where Lydia now stands. Each has waited by a bed like this. Each has known the shock of a life slipping unexpectedly. It is not death itself that shocks in Athens. Death is too common, too expected. What shocks is its suddenness, its swiftness, the way a man can be laughing 1 hour and gasping the next. What shocks is how the ordinary day, the grinding of grain, the shaping of clay, the painting of designs, can tilt so abruptly into crisis. And what shocks most of all is the quiet with which it happens, the stillness that follows as everyone waits to see if tomorrow will arrive for him. That night, you lie awake, the pallet hard beneath you, the air heavy with dust and worry. Around you, the household shifts restlessly, waking at every sound Theon makes. Outside, Athens continues as if nothing has changed. Voices murmur in the street, a dog barks, a cup is overturned in a nearby house. Life goes on, indifferent. And yet within these walls, one man's struggle has drawn all breath into its orbit. You realize then that survival in Athens was never a straight path. It was a tightrope, balanced precariously between health and sickness, between plenty and hunger, between peace and war. And any moment, any gasp, any slip, any shadow across the firelight could tilt it into darkness. That is the quiet shock of ancient life, not the clamor of battle or the grand speeches of leaders, but the fragile hush of a household waiting for the next breath. In the hush after fear, life reshaped itself gently. Morning comes to Athens not with trumpets or fanfare, but with the scrape of sandals on stone, the murmur of water at the fountain, the soft sigh of fires being coaxed into flame. After the long night of uncertainty, the household wakes in fragments, each member stirring from fitful sleep. Theon still breathes, though shallowly, his fever no worse than before. For Lydia, that alone is reason to move with steadier steps. For the others, it is reason enough to continue their work. In this city, balance is never found in certainties, but in the act of carrying on. You watch as Lydia begins her day by kneeling at the shrine in the corner. She offers a few olives, sets down a little bread, whispers a prayer so soft you cannot hear the words. Yet you understand the intention: to stitch back the fabric that frayed in the night. Melina helps her, placing a tiny clay figurine beside the offerings, one she made herself, crude but sincere. It is the kind of gesture no priest will record, but it binds the family together, reminding them of a shared hope. In the workshop, Diocles does what he has always done. He shapes clay. The wheel spins, steady and unbothered, as his hands press against the wet earth. Each vessel formed is an act of defiance against the chaos outside. He does not speak of Theon's illness, nor of the war, nor of the rumors from the port. Instead, he leans into the rhythm of craft, letting it hold him upright when fear threatens to tip him over. Alexios joins in, his strokes with the brush more focused than before. Even you, awkward with tools, find yourself steadier today, determined not to waste the clay entrusted to you. Balance in Athens is not an escape from hardship. It is a weaving of hardship into routine, until the sharpness dulls and becomes bearable. As the day unfolds, you notice how each member of the household adds a thread to that weave. Lydia keeps the fire hot, ensuring meals will come on time. Melina hums as she paints, her song a fragile thread of music holding the silence at bay. Even Theon, too weak to stand, insists on shaping a small coil of clay by hand, muttering that he must not be useless. The act is tiny, the result uneven, but it anchors him to life. At midday, the family gathers for a meal of barley bread and thin stew. There is no feast, no laughter, yet there is comfort in sitting together, in sharing food as though nothing has broken. The bread is torn by hand, the stew sipped slowly, the watered wine passed in the same cup. Conversation drifts not toward sickness or fear, but toward practical matters. What pigments remain, which clients await their orders, whether the kiln should be fired tonight or tomorrow. These words, ordinary as they are, act like stones on a riverbank, redirecting the current of thought away from panic. You step outside for a breath of air and find the city moving in much the same way. At the fountain, women fill their jars as always, their chatter subdued but persistent. Children chase one another barefoot, laughing as though their world is not shadowed by plague and war. Vendors shout less forcefully than yesterday, but they still shout. Life does not stop in Athens, not even when fear sits heavy in every chest. Instead, it bends, reshapes, finds its balance again through small continuities. Later, back in the workshop, Diocles pauses to wipe his hands on his tunic. "We work," he says, almost to himself, "because work is steadiness. Without it, we lose ourselves." You see it in his eyes. He is not blind to fear. He simply knows no other way to resist it than to keep shaping clay, one vessel at a time. His words echo in your mind, reminding you that balance is not found by avoiding hardship, but by pressing on through it, steadying yourself against what can still be done. As the sun sets, the household gathers again by the shrine. This time, they make their offerings with a little more ceremony. A few drops of oil are poured, a small chant is spoken in unison, and Lydia lifts her brother's hand to place it gently on the table before the gods. Theon's eyes, heavy-lidded, flicker with gratitude. He whispers a word, perhaps Athena's name, perhaps simply endure. It does not matter which. What matters is the gesture, a life too fragile to rise, still reaching for balance through ritual. That night, when the lamps are dimmed and the house settles into silence, you find yourself listening not only to the sounds of breathing and shifting bodies, but to the quiet rhythm beneath them. It is the rhythm of resilience, of a family carrying on in the face of uncertainty. The shock of yesterday lingers, yes, but it has been folded into the day's routine, softened by work, by prayer, by the stubborn insistence on continuing. As you close your eyes, you realize that this was Athens' greatest strength. Not its marble temples, not its grand assemblies, not even its victories in war. Its true strength was in the countless households like this one, finding balance again and again after each shock, refusing to let fear define the whole of life. Athens itself breathed in patterns of balance and strain. Athens does not rise all at once. It stirs like a great beast, each part waking in its own rhythm. First come the water carriers, slipping through half-lit streets with jars balanced on shoulders. Then the bakers, pulling loaves from clay ovens, their smoke winding into the dawn. By mid-morning, the city has found its full voice, a clamor of footsteps, shouts, bargaining prayers, and the endless clatter of craft. You follow Diocles into this current, his stride steady despite the weight of pots balanced carefully in baskets. Beside him, Alexios carries pigment jars, and you walk behind with simpler wares, your arms aching but determined. The streets, narrow and twisting, funnel you toward the great square at the city's heart, the Agora. Here, Athens reveals its rhythm. Stalls crowd the open space, covered with awnings of rough cloth. Vendors cry out their offerings, olives gleaming black and green, figs split open to show their sweet flesh, fish laid out on reed mats, already smelling of the sea and the heat. The air is heavy with scents, salt, smoke, honey, sweat. The ground is worn smooth by countless feet. Yet the Agora is more than a market. It is Athens itself in miniature, every class and purpose converging. Craftsmen display their goods, citizens gather in circles to argue politics, priests lead small processions past the stalls, children weave through the crowd, chasing one another, dodging between legs. A man with a scroll recites poetry for a few coins. A woman pours libations at a shrine set into the corner of a stoa. For a newcomer, it is overwhelming. But to Athenians, this rhythm is life. It is how the city balances itself against hardship, not by ignoring danger, but by weaving it into the routine. War may rage beyond the walls, sickness may creep through the port, but the agora continues. To stop would be to admit despair. Diocles conducts his business with practiced ease. He greets clients by name, bows just enough to honor their status, displays his wares with quiet confidence. Some admire the workmanship, some haggle fiercely, some wave him away. Each interaction is part of the balance. Give and take, trust and suspicion, the daily negotiation of survival. You notice how kindness appears even here in small exchanges. A vendor adds an extra olive to a child's handful. A woman pauses to tie the sandal of an elderly neighbor. A man pours a little wine into the dust for the thirsty dead before drinking himself. None of it erases the harshness of life, but it softens the edges, makes the rhythm bearable. In the afternoon, a herald's voice cuts across the market noise. He announces preparations for the upcoming festival, the Panathenaia, honoring the city's goddess. Despite war, despite plague, the celebration will proceed, and the news brings a ripple of relief. Festivals are more than pageantry, they are anchors. They remind Athenians of who they are together, not just what they suffer separately. You hear plans forming all around, garments to be woven, sacrifices to be prepared, songs to be rehearsed. Even those who have little will contribute something, for to neglect the goddess is to risk her favor. The festival becomes a promise that Athens, fragile as it is, still breathes, still sings, still honors what binds it together. As the sun lowers, shadows stretch long across the square. Diocles finishes his dealings, coins clinking softly in his pouch. The baskets are lighter now, some pots sold, others promised. He turns homeward, his expression weary but calm. The city, he says quietly, is like the wheel. It spins, whether smooth or rough, and we keep our hands steady. You follow him back through the streets, past houses where lamps are being lit, past children gathering firewood, past shrines where families kneel. The rhythm of Athens continues into night, feasting in wealthy homes, simple suppers in poorer ones, quiet prayers, laughter, murmurs, sighs. It is a rhythm that holds the city steady, even as danger presses close. That night, lying on your pallet once again, you feel the beat of that rhythm within you. It is not loud, not triumphant, but persistent. The city breathes, and in its breathing, it teaches you. Balance is not the absence of hardship, but the endurance of life in spite of it. Athens found calm in the great festival's solemn rhythm. The morning dawns brighter than most. A sense of expectation hangs in the air, subtle yet unmistakable, as though the city itself inhales together before releasing its breath in song. It is the day of the Panathenaia, the grand festival honoring Athena, guardian of the city, goddess of wisdom and warcraft. Even in years of hardship, this day is not neglected. For to forget Athena is to risk losing the very favor that holds Athens together. The household stirs earlier than usual. Lydia smooths the tunic she has been mending for weeks, ensuring every seam lies flat, though the fabric is worn thin. Melina places fresh flowers by the shrine before breakfast, her face solemn in the half-light. Diocles checks the pots he has set aside as offerings, while Alexios brushes dust from the patterns painted upon them. Each task is small, yet each carries weight. To appear unprepared at the festival is to dishonor not only the goddess, but also the families standing among neighbors. The streets outside are already alive. Women carry baskets of bread. Men lead goats bleating nervously toward sacrifice. Children skip along, clutching ribbons and garlands. You follow the household into this tide, feeling yourself swept into a current greater than any individual. The city converges upon the Acropolis, its sacred heart, where the great procession will begin. The air is filled with sound, the brassy call of trumpets, the low rumble of drums, the chant of priests leading prayers. Incense drifts in pale curls, mingling with the scent of animals and pressed olive leaves. Everywhere you look, people wear their best, tunics freshly washed, hair braided or tied with cords, sandals dusted clean. Even the poorest carry themselves with a quiet dignity. The procession begins with the young maidens of Athens, chosen from noble families, carrying sacred vessels. Their steps are slow, deliberate, as though each movement were part of a prayer. Behind them come citizens bearing weapons and shields, reminders that Athena is not only wise, but also a warrior. Then come the craftsmen, including Diocles, carrying their offerings, pottery adorned with scenes of gods and heroes, labor given shape and beauty. You walk with them, a stranger hidden in the line, yet no one questions your presence. The crowd is too focused on the goddess. At the head of the procession, a great robe, the peplos, is carried high. It is woven by the women of Athens over many months, embroidered with scenes of Athena's battles. Its fabric ripples in the sunlight, golden threads catching the eye. This robe is destined for the ancient wooden statue of the goddess, a gift renewed each festival, symbol of the city's devotion. The crowd murmurs as it passes, awe quieting even the children. The procession climbs toward the Acropolis. The steps are steep, the air hot, the press of bodies close. Yet the sense of shared purpose pushes everyone forward. By the time you reach the summit, sweat drips down your back, your arms ache from carrying pottery, yet your heart pounds with something like reverence. Before you stands the Parthenon, its marble columns blazing white against the sky. And within it, the goddess waits. Sacrifices follow. The goats and cattle, adorned with ribbons, are led to the altar. Their cries rise against the stone, followed by the swift motions of priests. Smoke billows as flesh burns, and the smell, sharp and heavy, fills the air. To modern senses, it is unsettling, but here it is sacred. The smoke is food for the gods, the meat later shared among the people. Sacrifice is not cruelty, but communion, a way of binding heaven and earth together. Prayers echo across the Acropolis. Hands lift in unison, voices murmur, heads bow. You find yourself moving with them, repeating words you barely understand, yet feeling their weight nonetheless. For in this moment, belief is not about knowledge, but about belonging. To kneel when others kneel, to rise when others rise, is to be part of Athens' living heart. After the formal rites, the festival shifts into celebration. Musicians strike their lyres, flutes trill high and bright, singers lift hymns to Athena. Competitions follow, races through the streets, wrestling matches in the sand, contests of poetry and song. Children laugh as they chase one another, garlands slipping from their heads. Vendors call out treats, honey cakes, figs dipped in wine, roasted chestnuts. For a time, the weight of war and sickness seems to lift, yet beneath the joy, you sense the fragility. Even as the crowd cheers a winning runner, whispers ripple of fevers near the port. Even as flutes play, someone coughs in the throng, and heads turn briefly before looking away. The festival is both shield and mirror, a shield against despair, a mirror of how precariously life balances. It is beautiful, but it is temporary. As evening falls, torches are lit, casting flickering light across the Acropolis. Songs grow slower, deeper, hymns blending with laughter, prayers with feasting. You sit with the household, sharing bread and wine, watching the glow of the city below. The Parthenon towers above, its columns shadowed in firelight, its goddess clothed once more in the peplos of devotion. For one night, Athens breathes as one. Citizens, foreigners, slaves, and children all find themselves gathered beneath the same sky, the same torches, the same songs. Whatever tomorrow brings, Spartan spears, plague, hunger, tonight belongs to Athena, and in her festival, balance is restored. As you return home, tired but calmed, you realize what this day means. It is not merely ritual, not merely spectacle. It is survival through meaning. The festival gives shape to fear, transforms it into song and offering. It binds people together, reminding them that they are not alone, that their struggles are shared, that their lives, however fragile, are part of something enduring. And so, when you lie on your pallet, the sounds of distant singing still echoing in your ears, you find yourself breathing easier. For Athens, for all its harshness, has shown you again how to find steadiness, not in certainty, but in devotion, in community, in the quiet strength of ritual repeated across generations. In the hush after song, unease drifted through the streets. The morning after the festival arrives slowly, as if Athens itself needs to recover from a long night of prayer, feasting, and music. The torches are extinguished, their smoke lingering faintly in the air. The garlands that had crowned children's heads lie wilted along the streets. Bits of bread, olive pits, and shattered pottery mark the places where celebration once roared. Yet the city breathes more softly now, each household stirring with the heaviness that follows a night of joy. Diocles wakes stiffly, rubbing his hands as if kneading away sleep. Lydia sweeps petals from the threshold before lighting the morning fire. Melina yawns as she fetches water, her feet dragging, though her eyes still glow from memories of dancing. Even Alexios, usually sharp-tongued, moves gently, speaking little as he clears tools from the workshop. The house seems wrapped in a fragile calm, as though everyone clings to the warmth of last night's torches before turning toward what waits beyond. Yet whispers come. At the fountain, women murmur about fevers. They speak in lowered voices, glancing over shoulders as though illness itself might overhear. A neighbor's child has taken to bed, burning hot. A merchant's wife coughed blood into a rag. Down by the port, sailors stumble with eyes red as coals. These stories travel as quickly as gossip always does in Athens, braided with worry, carried like smoke through alleys and courtyards. You hear them yourself as you wait in line with Melina. A woman behind you whispers of 3 deaths in a single night. Another claims to have seen a cart carrying bodies toward the outskirts. A third insists the sickness is punishment from Apollo, angered by neglected offerings. The truth is uncertain, but the fear is clear, winding itself through every word, every glance. When you return with the amphora filled, Lydia listens in silence. She does not dismiss the talk, but neither does she fan it into flame. She simply sets out herbs to dry by the fire, muttering about keeping the air clean. Her calm is like a stone in the river, redirecting the current of fear. Yet you see the way her hands tremble slightly as she arranges the leaves. By midday, the agora is thinner than usual. Some stalls remain shuttered, their awnings pulled down. The voices of vendors are softer, the bargaining less spirited. Priests stand at corners offering charms, selling sprigs of laurel or small amulets marked with protective symbols. A man burns incense in the open air, insisting it will drive away the poisoned winds. People pass quickly, eyes lowered, unwilling to linger. Diocles sells what he can, but he too notices the change. Business falters when fear grows, he mutters, half to you, half to himself. Yet even fear must eat. He presses forward, showing his pots, speaking of their strength, their beauty, their worth. But each conversation feels more brittle than before, as though one wrong word could shatter it. On the way home, you see a gathering near a doorway. A family stands outside, their faces drawn, their hands clutching one another. Inside, someone moans. Neighbors stand at a distance, murmuring prayers but stepping no closer. The sight roots you in place. This is no rumor, no whisper. This is the sickness itself, breathing in a home too close for comfort. That night, the household moves with unusual care. Lydia insists everyone wash hands and feet before eating, pouring extra water, though supplies are precious. Diocles burns herbs in the corner, letting the smoke drift through the room. Molina sings while she spins wool, but her voice is softer, as though she too senses the heaviness in the air. Even Theon, recovering still, asks fewer questions, lying back with a faraway look in his eyes. After supper, neighbors visit briefly, sharing scraps of news. One says the assembly may close the gates of Piraeus, though such a move would choke off supplies. Another speaks of physicians debating causes. Some blame tainted water, others accuse foreigners. A few insist it is the gods' displeasure. Each explanation seems possible, none comforting. Later, when the lamps are dimmed, you lie awake, listening. Outside, the city does not sing tonight. The streets are quieter, fewer voices carrying in the dark. Once or twice you hear a cough, harsh and ragged, echoing from somewhere too near. Once, you hear the sob of a woman, muffled quickly by a closing door. These sounds linger longer than any festival song, pressing into your chest with their weight. The night air drifts through the window, warm and still. You think of how fragile balance is, how one day of celebration can be followed by a whisper of despair. You think of the torches on the Acropolis, blazing steady in the dark, and wonder if their smoke reached the gods, or if it only curled into the air, unnoticed. Yet even in the heaviness, there is a kind of quiet strength. Lydia's herbs drying by the fire, Melina's song soft in the dim light, Diocles' steady shaping of clay. These are acts of defiance, small but certain. The sickness may come, but the household, like the city, continues. And in that persistence, there is balance still. At the city gates, war limped home on weary feet. The Dipolon gate loomed larger than usual that evening, its stone walls touched by the last light of the sun. Athens' main portal was always busy, with traders passing through, farmers bringing goods, travelers carrying news. But tonight, the air was charged in a different way. The crowd pressed close, faces strained, bodies leaning forward. Word had spread quickly. Soldiers were returning from the north. Some walked, some were carried, and no one knew who among them would come home whole. You followed Diocles, Lydia, and Melina through the winding streets until the gate rose before you. Even Alexios, usually bound to the workshop, joined the tide, drawn by the weight of uncertainty. Theon, though still recovering, insisted on being helped along, leaning heavily on a staff. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with determination. He had brothers in arms among those who might return tonight. The press of people thickened near the gate. Women craned their necks, men murmured prayers, children clung to skirts. At first, the soldiers were only shapes in the distance, a small band moving slowly toward the walls, their figures outlined against the deepening dusk. As they drew closer, details sharpened, bandages darkened by blood, tunics torn, steps uneven. Some leaned on comrades, some were carried on rough litters, others staggered alone with vacant eyes. The crowd surged forward, straining for recognition. Names were called, desperate, rising into the evening air. Some were answered by a lifted hand, a weary smile, a nod. Others went unanswered, leaving only silence. The sound of weeping soon mingled with the cries of joy. Families clutched survivors, pressing faces to dusty tunics, wrapping arms around trembling shoulders. Others collapsed where they stood, their hopes crushed by the absence of an answer. Theon's face shifted as he scanned the group. His lips moved in silent counting, eyes darting from face to face. At last, a sharp intake of breath escaped him. A man limped into view, bandaged at the thigh. It was his companion from Patadia. Relief and sorrow mingled in his expression. Relief at seeing a friend alive, sorrow at the many not returning. He leaned heavily on you for support as he raised a trembling hand in greeting. The soldier, seeing him, managed a faint smile before being guided away by family. The weight of war lay thick in the air. These men carried more than wounds. They carried the silence of those who had fallen, silence that pressed upon the city as heavily as the stench of blood. The crowd sensed it. Joy at reunion was tempered by dread, for each survivor was a reminder of another left behind. Then came the murmurs, quiet at first, then spreading through the throng. Some soldiers coughed, their breaths harsh and rattling. Others stumbled not just from wounds, but from fevers. Their eyes burned, their faces flushed. A mother pulled her child back quickly, fear flashing in her glance. The plague, some whispered. It has come with them. No official spoke the words aloud, but the shift in the crowd was clear. Relief gave way to unease. Embraces loosened. Bodies stepped back. Even love was edged by fear. The sick and the wounded alike were led through the gates, into the city's heart, into the very places where families slept, where children played, where life struggled to endure. As darkness fell, torches flared along the walls, casting long shadows across the ground. The crowd thinned slowly, each family leading their returned soldier away, each neighbor retreating to their street, each stranger carrying whispers home. You walked with the household, Theon leaning heavier on your arm than before. His silence said more than words. He had seen this before, the mingling of wounds and sickness, and he knew what it could mean. Back at the potter's house, Lydia moved quickly. She set out water, tore strips of linen, and boiled herbs. Theon was made to rest, though his eyes remained troubled. Diocles sat quietly, rubbing his temples. Even Alexios was subdued, his usual sharpness dulled. Melina tried to hum as she spun wool, but her voice faltered halfway through the tune. The night was heavy. Later, neighbors knocked, voices low, faces drawn. They asked after Theon, shared news of who had returned, who had not. One woman, her eyes red from crying, whispered that her brother had been carried back only to die at the gate, before she could reach him. Another spoke of a soldier who collapsed in the street, his skin flushed with fever, foam on his lips. Some claimed it was battlefield exhaustion. Others swore it was the sickness spreading from the port. The truth was uncertain, but the fear was undeniable. As the visitors drifted away, Lydia placed her hand on Theon's brow, frowning at the warmth there. He insisted it was only fatigue, the walk too much for his still healing leg. Yet in her eyes you saw the doubt. She fetched more herbs, pressing them into a cloth, laying it gently against his skin. Theon closed his eyes, whether from comfort or resignation, you could not tell. When the lamps were lowered, the household lay together in uneasy silence. Outside, the city was restless. Dogs barked, carts creaked, voices carried faintly in the night. Somewhere, a woman wailed, her grief echoing through the narrow streets. Athens, so recently united in song and celebration, now seemed divided by shadows. The shadow of war, the shadow of sickness, the shadow of what tomorrow might bring. Lying on your pallet, you thought of the soldiers at the gate, their weary bodies bearing wounds both seen and unseen. You thought of the families who had embraced them, and of the families who had wept at silence, and you thought of the whispers, spreading like smoke, creeping into every corner of the city. Behind shuttered doors, fevers glowed like hidden fires. The days following the soldiers' return unfolded with a strange quiet, as though Athens itself had paused between breaths. The city, still carrying echoes of festival hymns, now heard different sounds drifting through its streets. Not the laughter of neighbors or the bargaining of vendors, but coughing, moaning, whispers exchanged at doorways. It began near the port, where ships from across the Aegean unloaded grain and goods. Families who had fled the countryside now crowded into small rooms near Piraeus, their homes hastily built of timber and mud, pressed close together. The illness took hold there first, children falling silent, mothers burning with fever, fathers stumbling with red eyes. The gossip of sickness no longer traveled as rumor. It walked openly, borne by pale figures too weak to hide their symptoms. Soon, the stories reached every neighborhood. At the fountains, fewer women gathered. Some carried not just water jars, but rags dampened for wiping foreheads. At the agora, stalls stood empty, shutters drawn, as vendors vanished overnight. Men who had argued politics only days before now disappeared from their usual spots, their benches abandoned. Even the loudest voices of debate were replaced by silence. Within the potter's household, unease deepened. Lydia washed hands more often, boiling water and steeping herbs, the sharp smell filling every corner. Diocles continued his work, but his jaw remained tight, his movements sharper than before. Melina asked questions, her voice trembling though she tried to sound brave. Alexios muttered about the gods, about whether sacrifices had been neglected, about neighbors who deserved the goddess's anger. His words carried fear, not certainty. Theon grew, restless. Though his leg healed slowly, he insisted on helping where he could, painting simple patterns on pottery or shaping clay with careful hands. Yet often his work paused as he stared toward the street, listening for sounds beyond the walls, carts creaking, cries rising, silence stretching too long. He knew, as all soldiers did, that enemies did not always wear armor. Sometimes they came unseen, striking harder than spears. One afternoon, the proof arrived too close for comfort. A knock at the door revealed a neighbor, her face pale, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. She asked for water, her voice weak, eyes bloodshot. Lydia moved quickly, offering a cup, her hands steady, though her breath caught. The woman drank, then coughed sharply, flecks of blood marking her lips. She staggered away without a word, leaving silence in her wake. No one spoke for a long while after the door closed. The household grew quieter. Meals were taken with fewer words. Work continued, but without song. At night, you heard new sounds beyond the shutters, the low moans of the sick, the hurried footsteps of families carrying loved ones to healers, the scrape of wheels as bodies were drawn toward burial grounds. The city, once noisy with its endless life, now spoke in muted tones of suffering. Priests walked the streets more often, swinging censers heavy with incense. Their smoke curled in the air, mixing with the scent of sweat and fever. Some claimed the gods were angry, that offerings must be doubled. Others argued it was poisoned water, bad winds, or foreign corruption. The explanations multiplied, but none slowed the spread. You watched as the rhythms of Athens shifted. Children no longer played in alleys. Markets closed earlier. Doors were bolted from within, shutters barred. The narrow streets, once crowded with laughter and shouts, now echoed with emptiness. Athens had become both vast and small, vast with its fear, small with its confinement. At night, Lydia lit extra lamps, though oil was precious. "Darkness carries sorrow too easily," she murmured. The flickering flames pushed back the shadows, casting soft light over weary faces. In that glow, the family huddled together, drawing comfort from nearness, even as the world outside grew distant. The illness crept on. A child from down the street disappeared from play, his toys left scattered. A merchant's stall stood empty 3 mornings in a row. Voices whispered of entire households gone silent, their doors unopened, their hearths cold. The plague was no longer rumor, nor even news from afar. It was here, pressing close, breathing through the same walls, carried by the same wind. And yet, amid the fear, life persisted. Clay was shaped, meals were cooked, prayers were offered. The household, like so many others, clung to routine as though each act of normalcy could hold back the tide. Perhaps it could not stop the illness, but it could steady the heart. And in such steadiness, survival found its foothold. When you lay down at night, pallet rough beneath you, you listened not just for the coughs beyond the door, but for the breaths within the room. Diocles steady and low, Lydia lighter and restless, Molina soft as a sigh, Theon uneven, Alexios sharp. Each breath was a measure of survival, each night a fragile victory. Old songs carried comfort through fevered nights. When the city's speech grew thin and the usual clatter of trade fell away, another language rose to fill the air. The language of music. It was not the bright music of festivals with flutes flashing and dancers racing in circles. This was humbler, closer to the hearth. Lullabies remembered from mothers now gone, work chants that kept hands steady, hymns sung so softly that only the lamp flame seemed to lean closer to listen. In a season when physicians disagreed and neighbors crossed the street to avoid one another's breath, songs could still pass from mouth to mouth without fear. And in the potter's house, as fever knocked and footsteps slowed, it was music that wove the night together, so it did not split. Theon's strength rose and fell like a tide, and in those hours when his thoughts drifted untethered, Lydia began to sing. She did not announce it, did not clear her throat, or ask for silence. She simply lowered herself to the pallet edge, smoothed the linen at her brother's shoulder, and shaped a melody that carried no argument and asked for nothing in return. The tune was narrow, only a few notes held and turned, as simple as a prayer said with a working woman's breath. It came from their mother, who had learned it at the loom, where threads crossed and crossed until cloth emerged. It came from the season when their father marched and did not return for a winter. It came from the days when sorrow was too large for words, but small enough to be folded into a tune. Molina, who had been the first to paint vines along a cup, and make them look as if they moved in wind, took the melody up without being told. Her voice was thinner, younger, but she carried the line carefully, like a cup brimming to the edge. Alexios set down his brush and pretended to sort tools. You could see him measuring the air to find the note, then joining under his breath, low as a drum far away. Even Diocles, who rarely sang and had little patience for what did not turn clay to money, hummed through his nose in a way that warmed the room. The house gathered itself around the song until the song seemed to be the house, beams, plaster, and air turning gentle in its presence. Outside, the sickness continued its unhurried work. Doorways showed new marks of ash, a sign that a family inside had sent a prayer outward and hoped it might be seen. The market closed early. The fountain queue stood farther apart. Night watchmen passed with slower steps, as if sound itself had grown costly. But within, something held. The melody did not cure, not in the way a modern hand might wish, with tablets and measured dosing. It did something smaller and more stubborn. It kept breath steady. It reminded hands to be kind. It measured the minutes so that fear could not fill all of them. In the middle of one such night, when the lamp had burned tall and then guttered low, Theon shivered and spoke a name that belonged to a companion from the line. He reached into the air as if the past had shape and could be held. Lydia's voice did not falter. She dropped 2 tones and sang slower, laying the sound as if it were a warm cloth across his chest. When his hand fell, she did not say, "It is over," or "You are safe." She sang the old refrain about wheat stalks bending together so the wind cannot break them. The house became a field, and for a moment the air moved as if along tassels, and nothing, not plague nor rumor nor memory, could stand upright against that bend. There were other songs too, for smaller hours. There was the counting song that kept the grinding stone turning, a way to turn effort into steps. 1 for the body, 2 for the bread, 3 for the ones we have lost, 4 for the ones we still hold. Molina liked that one, and would tap 3 times against the rim of a bowl at the end, as if knocking softly on a door only memory could open. There was a nonsense tune for the kiln, a string of syllables learned from a neighbor who swore the vowels pleased the fire and made glazes come out deep as olives. It had no meaning, and every meaning. Even Alexios smiled when the kiln answered, with a neat, satisfied crack, like the lid of a jar settling. Sometimes, in late afternoon, when heat pressed and the street lay quiet as a held breath, a flute from somewhere would find its way between houses. The player remained unseen, perhaps a boy perched on a stair, perhaps a sailor with no ship to board, perhaps an old man with a crack along the mouthpiece that made every note carry a grainy sweetness. The line of sound drifted over the rooftops and down into the courtyards, stitching one home to the next. You could see it in the way shoulders loosened at windows, in the way girls at the loom let strands slip without scolding, in the way a stray dog set its head down and slept. When the flute paused for breath, the city seemed to exhale with it, as if remembering that lungs have more than one purpose. News still arrived, as news insists on doing. A cousin in a distant ward, a priest with a new charm, a neighbor who said the wells must be circled with laurel leaves, a trader who had heard of a town across the strait where songs were sung all day, and the sickness passed them by. That last story was likely not true, or true only in the way a wish can be, but no one corrected it. Some rumors you let stand because they make a softer pillow. Lydia would nod, add herbs to the pot, and then, once the door had closed and the pot had settled to a simmer, she would sing again, not to drown the news, but to set it somewhere it could not spill. It was not always Lydia who began. Once, when the light failed early and the workshop lay in blue-gray, you picked up the tune before realizing what your mouth had done. Your voice, unused to public work, came tentative. You shaped a melody from another life, a line that spoke of rain on long roads and windows kept open to hear it. The words did not belong to this place, but the shape of the sound did, and the household turned toward it, as a plant turns toward light. When you faltered, Melina slipped under your note and held it until you found yourself again. Afterwards, no one mentioned that you had carried a foreign tune into their room. They did not ask where you learned it. They only borrowed it gently, as one borrows a cup, to fill and return, warmed by use. The city kept its own repertoire. Priests moved with censers, and there were hymns that named Apollo by his stringed power, and Asclepius by the staff twined with life. On certain mornings, a procession of boys passed the corner, their voices thin but brave, carrying a paean they had been taught for occasions when human hands felt too small. The notes rose, slid, and settled, and for a few breaths, the air tasted like pine wood in cold weather. Whether the gods listened or not, Athens did. The songs lifted the city over its own threshold, enough to step from one day to the next. There were near silences too, for songs cannot pour where grief fills every bowl. A door would be marked, and for a while, voices in that street would turn inward, too tender to be used. In those stretches, music took other shapes. The slow rhythm of wool passing over a spindle, the measured tap of a pestle against a mortar, the small squeak of a hinge that had always had that fault and always would. These were their own kind of songs, patterns that kept time moving even when throats could not. How many households have been carried by such sounds the world over in any century? A question asked by no one aloud, and yet answered each time a hand resumes a task. Once, a neighbor child came to the doorway with eyes wide and a voice trapped behind them. She had seen the cart that morning, the one no one wished to see, and she could not put the picture down. Melina let her in without fuss. She found a cracked cup with a vine she had painted herself, filled it with watered wine, and, with a calm that seemed older than her hands, began a foolish song about a crooked cat who always landed in the right bowl. It was nothing, a child's trick, and yet the girl laughed once, then again, and then the tears came easily, and so did breath. When the girl had gone home, Lydia kissed the top of Melina's head and did not speak. The song had done its work, and doing had needed no proclamation. Not every night gave music space. There were hours when fever insisted, when cloths had to be changed and bowls brought, and a hand held without letting go, even when it cramped. There were nights when Theon slept, but dreamt loudly, and the room had to be kept still so that dream would not harden into something that would break inside him. In those hours, music became less sound than posture. The way Lydia sat with her back straight so the room could lean on her. The way Diocles tended the lamp so its light would not waver. The way Alexios rested a hand on the kiln wall to feel its heart and judge, without looking, that tomorrow's firing would be good. And yet, even then, when a crack opened between tasks and breath, someone would lay a line of melody across it like a plank. Sometimes it was only 2 notes, a dip and a rise, with no words at all. Sometimes it was a child's counting. Sometimes it was the memory of a festival chorus sung very faintly, as if recalling a torch that had burned the night before last, and could burn again if asked gently. The songs were not a cure. They were a way to inhabit the night without surrendering it. It happened, too, that a patient who could not swallow broth could still accept a tune. You saw it with your own eyes when a neighbor woman, her face pale and lips dry, was given a song instead of spoon or cup. She closed her eyes and let the sound sit on her tongue. When it finished, she took the broth. Perhaps the one made room for the other. Perhaps the body recognizes syllables as a kind of nourishment when other foods have turned strange. The physics of it mattered less than the fact. The song opened a door that had refused hinge and key. Days passed, measured by these quiet arts. The kiln burned and cooled to a hiss. The wheel turned and stopped. The lamp stood and softened into dawn. News continued, the city's counting of loss, its small totals of relief. But the household's reckoning was simpler. A night carried, a morning found. The field beyond the walls ripened in the dry way it does under Greek summers. 1,000 delicate rattles where grain heads knock. From the roof at dusk, with the city subdued around you, and the sky taking on its old copper at the edges, you could hear that sound if you listened. The countryside singing its own dry cut time, as if reminding the city that all living still moves toward harvest, even in hard years. One evening, when the heat finally loosened and a draft found the corridor, you placed the last cup on the shelf and stood still. There was no melody in the room just then. It took you a moment to notice that the silence itself had changed. It was not the brittle silence of dread, nor the muffled one of exhaustion. It was slack water, the small pause when current shifts. Theon slept without fever. Lydia's hands lay open on her lap. Alexios had fallen into that deepest craftsman's rest, the kind you can only enter after the day has taken from you everything you can give. Melina, forehead inked with a smudge of pigment, breathed the small, even breaths of a child who has worked herself safely to sleep. The house was singing without sound, and the song said simply, "We are all here." You thought, then, of how many musicless cures history will never count, of how many fevers subsided under a line of melody, of how many nights were survived because someone remembered a tune. The records would note assemblies and treaties, births and deaths, numbers counted with tidy certainty. They would not write down how the room softened when a voice bent a note to meet another, or how a girl traded her own sleep for a lullaby. But here now, without marble or inscription, the truth stood whole. Song keeps breath company, and breath, kept company, chooses to continue. Outside, a distant flute began again, the same hopeful, worn instrument, or another just like it. The line wandered, doubled back on itself, then found a sturdier path and walked it. You could not see the player. It was enough to know that somewhere a pair of hands had chosen to make sound rather than wait for silence to deepen. That choice passed through the walls, through the lung, through the pulse. It set nothing on fire, and yet it warmed the night. Whispers of plague unsettled the city's heart. The whispers did not begin in the center of Athens, but at its edges, near the port where ships groaned against stone piers and strangers disembarked with sunburned shoulders. It was there, in narrow lanes where walls leaned too close and air moved too slowly, that the first rumors thickened into certainty. A mother carried a child too still. A sailor collapsed before he could bargain for figs. A healer shook his head and left a home with his satchel unopened. At first, such news traveled like any other, through the mouths of neighbors, across the water jars filled at dawn, in the murmurs exchanged while waiting for bread. Yet soon, the tone changed. Words were no longer spoken lightly, but with glances over the shoulder, with lowered lids, with hands raised to cover the mouth. What had been rumor grew into recognition, and recognition drew fear like iron to a magnet. The agora shrank. Stalls that once shouted their wares now whispered, or closed entirely. Men who loved to debate politics chose silence, preferring not to gather where breath might be shared. Priests, who usually kept their pace steady, began walking faster, swinging censers until smoke clouded their own eyes. Even children, whose laughter normally ran ahead of them like a bright scarf in wind, played more softly, if they played at all. Diocles continued to turn his wheel. The clay demanded shaping, and orders had to be filled, but his motions carried a new sharpness. His hands struck the rim too hard. His breath grew short, though he was not sick. Lydia boiled water more often, filling the air with bitter herbs. Molina watched the street from a crack in the shutter, whispering each time she saw another household door marked with ashes. Alexios, restless, muttered about bad winds, about the gods angered, about neighbors who had failed to sacrifice properly. Theon, still healing, said little. He sat, with his legs stretched and eyes narrowed, as though scanning a battlefield invisible to anyone else. The plague was not yet everywhere, but Athens was already closing in on itself. Families who had fled the countryside were crammed inside the city walls. Streets pressed tighter, fountains drew longer lines, waste piled where carts could not pass quickly enough. The very strategy that promised safety from Sparta had become a trap against an unseen enemy. Whispers told of symptoms: fever like fire, eyes reddening until sight blurred, throats closing as if air itself had turned against the body. Some said blood appeared where it should not. Some said the skin turned black in patches. Some swore men raved in madness before collapsing. The details shifted, but the fear did not. The uncertainty was worse than any single truth, for it made every cough suspect, every stumble ominous. One afternoon, while returning from the market, you heard a cry that cut sharper than the usual din. At a corner, a man sat against a wall, his face ashen, his chest heaving. Passers-by skirted wide, pulling their garments across their noses. None stopped. He was not beaten, not robbed, yet people treated him as though he were already gone. His hand reached out once, then fell. You moved on too, carried by the current of fear. That moment stayed in your chest longer than the sight itself, the knowledge that pity had become a dangerous luxury. Inside the potter's home, routines became shields. Bread was still baked, though thinner. Clay was still kneaded, though slower. Lamps were still lit, though oil was measured more carefully. Lydia prayed at the shrine with greater diligence, pouring wine and crumbling bread, her lips moving soundlessly for each child, each neighbor, each absent face. Molina copied her mother's gestures, small hands trembling slightly as she set olives at the foot of a figurine. Alexios rolled his eyes, but did not protest. Even he feared the silence more than the ritual. Theon, perhaps sensing what others did not yet admit, began telling stories from the war, not of glory, but of endurance. He spoke of nights when soldiers shared stale bread beneath their shields, of mornings when wounds ached, but laughter returned anyway, of days when retreat seemed certain until one man raised his spear and reminded the others to follow. His voice, roughened by fever and smoke, carried steadiness the household needed more than food. As night fell, the city seemed to draw tighter still. Dogs barked less, footsteps hurried more. Lamps burned longer inside homes, though oil was scarce, as if people feared the dark more than expense. And beneath it all, the whispers thickened. Tomorrow, the plague will be everywhere. Tomorrow, it will knock at your door. Tomorrow, breath itself will betray you. Yet even in those hours, there were counter-whispers. A neighbor shared herbs said to ward off fever. A child hummed a lullaby that softened her mother's face. A pot left at the doorstep contained barley for the hungry. These were not cures, but they were threads, small, fragile, woven tightly enough to keep despair from tearing the fabric completely. The night closed around Athens, its streets hushed and watchful. Within the potter's house, you lay awake on the pallet, listening to the breathing around you. Each sound, each rise and fall of chest became a reassurance. The sickness might be near, but here, for this moment, life held. Rituals of faith bound weary souls together. In Athens, when the air itself felt uncertain, and each street carried a hush that did not belong to summer, faith became more than custom. It became breath, thread, rope across a chasm. Where reason failed and medicine faltered, hands turned to altars, lips shaped prayers, and offerings filled small shrines until their edges looked like crowded tables after harvest. To live through plague was to live with the gods constantly near, called not only in temples, but in kitchens, courtyards, and doorways. In the potter's home, Lydia began each day with the same gesture, bread broken, a piece set aside for Hestia, guardian of the hearth. The fragment was no longer than a fingernail, no richer than the rest, but it represented the whole. "Keep the fire steady," she murmured, eyes on the flame. "Keep us warm, keep us safe." Melina mirrored her mother, sometimes offering a fig or an olive pit, learning that devotion was measured not in gold, but in attention. Even Alexios, skeptical by habit, did not laugh. In days when neighbors' doors were marked with silence, one mocked prayer was one thread cut too soon. At dusk, when the streets thinned and the agora emptied, the sound of processions drifted over the rooftops. Priests carried censers heavy with resin, smoke billowing in clouds that blurred torchlight. Children followed, holding laurel branches, their voices carrying hymns to Apollo the healer. The lines were uneven, the chants unpolished, but sincerity gave them weight. Families pressed to windows, whispering responses, each hoping that the gods' gaze might pause at their doorway. One evening, Diocles returned from a client with news of an assembly decision. Sacrifices at the great altar of Athena would be doubled, funded by the treasury itself. The city, proud of its marble, its fleets, its philosophers, had been reduced to simple pleas. Crowds filled the Acropolis, each carrying what they could: a goat, a basket of grain, a cup of oil. Smoke rose in columns thick enough to dim the sky, mixing with cries of prayer and the bleating of animals. Even those too poor to give brought pebbles to throw upon the pile, believing that the act itself counted as devotion. In the household, faith was woven into daily labor. When clay was mixed, Lydia murmured to Gaia, asking for earth to remain steady beneath their feet. When water was fetched, Melina dropped a sprig of mint in the jug, whispering to the nymphs who guarded springs. When the kiln was lit, Alexios muttered a charm he claimed to despise, repeating words half sung, half sworn, so the fire would temper evenly. "It is habit," he said when caught, but his eyes betrayed relief when the pots emerged whole. Theon, legs still stiff, spoke often of Asclepius, god of healing. From his soldier's bed, he described the sanctuaries where the sick slept, hoping for dreams that carried cures. "I once saw a man who claimed the god touched his shoulder," Theon recalled, voice low. he woke without pain. Who can say? Whether story or truth, the household listened as though healing itself seeped from the telling. Yet faith was not only in gods, it was in each other. Neighbors left herbs at one another's thresholds. Old women tied bits of wool to doors as charms against fever. Children carried water to families too weak to fetch it themselves. None of these acts bore inscriptions or marble, yet they stitched survival more tightly than decrees. To live in Athens was to know that devotion might come as much from the hand next door as from Olympus above. One night, when whispers of the plague pressed harder, Lydia gathered her family around the shrine. She placed a small cup of wine and lit a second lamp. For the absent, she said simply. Each named someone they feared for, a cousin, a neighbor, a child glimpsed at the fountain who had not returned. The names hung in the smoke like beads on a thread, and though none could promise protection, all felt steadier for having spoken them. For you, these rituals carried a double weight. You knew the plague would not be stayed by chance alone, that the fever had no regard for laurel smoke or olive oil. Yet you saw how ritual transformed fear into shape, gave hands something to do besides tremble, lent nights a rhythm other than dread. It was not magic that sustained them, but meaning. Without it, silence might have hollowed the house. With it, even grief carried form. As the city's walls trapped breath and rumor, faith spilled over them. Songs drifted from shrines at crossroads. Priests pressed amulets into hands rough from labor. Even skeptics lit lamps longer than before. Athens, which had boasted of reason, of debate, of mastery over thought, found itself again as a city of prayers. And though the sickness advanced, though doors were closed and tears fell into bowls of broth, devotion kept the fragile web from tearing entirely. At first light, hands returned to the wheel. Dawn slipped into Athens the way a careful hand eases a cup onto a crowded shelf, slowly, listening for any rattle, making room where there seemed to be none. The night's hush thinned to the small sounds that mean survival has kept its appointment. A hinge complaining, a fire taking breath, a jar tapping stone as it set down just so. In the potter's house, Lydia was first to move. She did not rush. She pressed her palm to the cool of the amphora, tested the banked embers, and let her shoulders fall by a thumb's width as the coals answered with a red eye opening. Work, patient as a mule, stood at the door. She let it in. You rose with the others. The room in that hour carried the clean scent only a city at edge of light can know. Ash cooled, clay settled, olive oil breathing from wooden stoppers. The night's fear left like dew on the threshold and not yet tracked inside. Theon was awake, propped on his elbow, his gaze clear in the gentle gray. Fever had not visited in the dark. He smiled the way men do when they must conserve their strength, a smile that moves mostly in the eyes. The wheel, he said lightly, still needs turning. He no longer tried to stand before the day had proven itself. Wisdom had crept in with the ache. Breakfast was small and sure. Lydia divided barley bread with the care of a scribe, each piece neat as a line on wax. Melina drizzled a thread of oil and set 2 olives by each portion, a ceremony of sufficiency. Diocles, who saved words for clay, touched your wrist briefly, his way of wishing courage without disturbing the morning's delicate balance. Alexios inspected the pigment jars, grumbling softly at a stubborn lid, then laughed at himself for grumbling. Laughter, small and serviceable, was another tool laid out with the brushes. Then the day arranged itself. Water first. The amphora lifted onto a shoulder, the rope biting in with its familiar reminder. You and Melina walked the narrow run to the fountain, the stones still holding night cool. Other households had the same idea. Women with braided hair damp from washing, a boy clasping a small jug to his chest as if it were a bird, an old man with hands that remembered the mine long after his back had forgotten the field. No one spoke loudly. Greetings were pressed like seal rings into wax, clear, quick, meant to endure a little handling. The queue stood a fraction wider than in easier times, but it stood. That, too, was a kind of faith. The water ran cloudy at first, then cleared. You watched it brighten into something that promised to be kind to the mouth. Melina, solemn as an officiant, tipped the jug a finger's breadth to let the first cup for the house spirits splash onto the dust, a ritual learned not from temple teachers, but from kitchen ones. On the way back, she pointed to a doorway marked with ash. "Nico's mother," she whispered. You nodded. She did not want words, only witness. The city, thinned by night, was thickening again around its absences. Back home, the wheel began. Diocles set his foot, found the old rhythm, and the room remembered its own heart. Clay rose under his hands in a slow argument with gravity, first a wobble, then a sway, then the fine, shivering decision that turns earth into shape. He did not hurry the moment. A rushed rim is a cracked rim. Beside him, you worked the wedging table, folding the clay into itself, pressing out small treacheries of air. The task asked nothing, glittering of you, only attention. In plague time, that was a relief, to be wanted precisely for a steady palm. Alexios ground red earth in the mortar. His shoulders carried the narrow brace that belongs to men who have known many disappointments of fire and still return to the kiln with trust. He tested the black slip with a fingertip, drew a line on a shard, blew, watched the shine settle. "Not too thin," he muttered. "Not too proud." He set it to the pigment, perhaps to himself. Melina set the brushes along a folded cloth and placed a small bowl at each station, a girl's generosity in order. When she sat, she drew the curve of a vine that did not exist an hour ago, a vine that grew from the memory of the alley fig tree, from yesterday's story, from the shape of her mother's hum when the bread rose well. She painted leaves that had learned to be leaves by watching her hand. Through the morning, the house kept the world in its proper scale. Outside, the city stirred and cleared its throat. You could feel it in the wall, the tremor of footsteps on the street, and a cart's complaint made of iron and wood. A priest's voice passed by once, even and bright, blessing doorways with laurel smoke. From 2 lanes away, a cough repeated at intervals that set every ear on edge, then stopped. Sometimes the worst mercy is silence, sometimes the best. Theon called for a low stool and a board on his knees. "Give me the handles," he said. Lydia hesitated, measuring the day with a mother's unerring instrument, then relented. He took the leather-hard cups one by one and cut small bridges of clay, fitting them to the forms as if affixing ears to a head. His knife made a whisper of its own. Every third piece, he paused to breathe with care, letting breath be an ally. When he looked up, he found you watching. "The body listens," he said, "if you ask it softly." He returned to the work. He would not allow himself the pride of speed. He took instead the steadier pride of rightness. At mid-morning, a neighbor arrived with word of a delivery. 2 craters due at a house near the painted stoa by dusk. "They still drink?" she said without judgment. "And so they still order." Lydia's mouth sketched a line you had come to recognize. the line that means a calculation complex as any geometry but made of bread, oil, risk, and road. She agreed. Work is not only making, but moving. The city must see that this household's hand remains steady. So the team shifted. Diocles finished shaping the craters and set them to the sun's shoulder for a little time. Alexios checked the kiln's clay throat, scraping away a cough of soot from the flue. Melina chose a pattern, modest and quick, laurel and wave, a border of endurance. You sanded bases until they felt like the inside of a shell. Theon traced 2 names on the underside with a stylus. For return, he said, because even in an uncertain world, the polite fiction of permanence has sweet weight. While the craters firmed enough for their short walk to the kiln's edge, Lydia claimed the interval for quiet chores that look like nothing until you remove them and the house collapses. The sweep that keeps grit from a bare foot. The loop of thread that ties a curtain and makes a breath of breeze. The refilling of the lamp that prevents darkness from having a pretext. She paused long enough to reach for your forearm in passing. Apology for asking much. Gratitude for getting it. The touch stayed longer on your skin than any ring could. Firing day proceeded like a composed argument. Alexios laid the kiln, measured wood, coaxed flame into seriousness. The first heat is always the test of both temper and temper. He listened with his hand on the brick, the way a shepherd listens to flock by ground and not ear. "She'll take it," he announced at last, smiling at the kiln's feminine pronoun, as if he did not believe in it even as he used it. Smoke climbed in a straight column. The neighborhood allowed itself a small exhale. A good firing steadies more than shelves. While heat worked its secret mathematics, you and Diocles loaded the handcart with finished pieces for the afternoon delivery. The 2 craters, 4 cups, a small jug that insisted on joining, as jugs do. Lydia packed straw and cloth around them with the heart of a cautious captain. "The city can have them," she said to the pots in a tone that made them behave, "but not the street." Theon watched, then lifted 2 strips of leather and tied a better knot around the load. "We are not rich," he said, "but we can be competent." The walk toward the painted stoa took you through Athens at its truest scale. The thread and needle alleys, the sudden widenings, the compressions where 2 walls once quarreled and never repaired their distance. People moved in measured lanes, like fish in a stream that had learned each other's intent. Some faces were masked with cloths dipped in vinegar. Some were bare and stubborn. Most were simply human, trying to carry an errand to its finish line. You saw a boy running with a message, a woman tracing a symbol on a door with oil, a grocer placing figs in piles that argued for abundance even on a thin day. The city had not agreed to die. It was busy. At the client's house, the courtyard held the gentle echo that belongs to places maintained by hands you do not see. The steward took the delivery, counted with an eye taught to count not only coins, but circumstance. "Good," he said, and meant it both for the pots and for the fact of their arrival. Silver changed hands with the small, reluctant silver feels when sent on a meaningful errand. "You may leave by the back," he added. Fewer breaths. It was both courtesy and warning. On the way home, you cut across the stoa, its painted panels half-shadowed, colors breathing in shade. 2 men debated in low voices about whether the assembly would suspend meetings or move them to the open air on the hill. A third sat apart, lips moving with a fragment of verse that had kept him company since boyhood. At the far end, a scribe wiped his tablet and began again. "There is a courage in beginning again that no law can write, returning by a quieter route, You passed a door just as a woman inside began to sing. It was a work song turned to a blessing by the simple fact of being sung nearer to tears than to grain. You could not see her face. You did not need to. Lydia slowed for the length of 2 heartbeats, her head tilted in acknowledgement, and then walked on. Grief in Athens was allowed to be public by such small permissions: an untightened pace, a hand set to wood as you pass. At the house, the kiln announced its first soft, cracking language, the language of vessels becoming what they meant to be. Alexios stood there with the posture of a man eavesdropping on fate and finding the conversation mildly favorable. He grinned, embarrassed by his own relief, and busied himself at once to hide it. Mind the draw, he told you, and you minded it, not because you knew all his reasons, but because, in a house, obedience to craft sustains as surely as explanation. Afternoon bowed to evening with the slow hinge of a well-tended door. Shadow climbed the walls, making the workshop cooler, kinder. Theon slept, a soldier's clipped sleep, and woke with a face easier than at noon. He asked for a scrap of leather and braided it into a loop, then looped it over a peg by the window. "For luck," he said. "For air." The small movement made the curtain breathe. Lydia smiled with her eyes the way women do when a man has finally chosen a useful superstition. She set a dish of barley porridge beside him, with a note of triumph. It was warm and did not spill. They lit the evening lamp early, to honor fatigue with light rather than shame it into darkness. Bread, olives, and the heel of yesterday's cheese appeared in their careful places. No one made speeches about gratitude. They ate the way tired people eat, thoroughly, accepting the bargain food offers. 1 more hour of steadiness in exchange for chewing and quiet. Diocles counted coins, flicking them with a nail in a way that told him as much by sound as sight. He set aside 3 for oil, 2 for barley, 1 for pigment, 1 for luck. Luck was the purse itself, which needed the weight of a coin to feel it lived in the world. After the meal, work did not end so much as change its costume. Melina brought a basket of wool and a spindle. Lydia set a crack-mended cup near the lamp and rinsed it with wine to christen its second life. Alexios, once the kiln's breath settled, sketched patterns on a shard, trying a new way to turn waves into a band that suggested both sea and sleep. You cleaned the brushes, laid them to dry like reeds along a bank, then sat still long enough to hear the house speak plainly. A kiln ticking, a rope stretching, a body shifting on a pallet, a lamp asking for another drop and receiving it. News came on 2 legs and in 2 tones. A boy with good breath and a message from the neighbor 3 doors down. The fever had eased for her husband. An old man with careful feet who brought the other kind. The baker on the corner had closed his oven at midday and not reopened, and smoke had not come out of his chimney since. Lydia received both tidings with the same wide steadiness. "We will bake early," she said, not changing her voice for grief or relief, as if to instruct the day itself to continue obeying. As night gathered, the city outside sounded like a held chord. Athens had learned how to be quiet without surrendering the tone of itself. A dog barked once and reconsidered. A child laughed, corrected herself to a giggle, then forgot to be quiet and laughed again. The best music of the week. Somewhere a flute found its low register and stayed there, a river noise for streets that needed a river. You took your place by the door a while, a watch post no one assigned you but all appreciated. The lintels cool pressed into your back. The air that had warmed to human business cooled enough to be shared again. You thought of all the hands at wheels in all the houses that still had wheels, of all the kilns offering their brick lungs to the city's need for cups and light and the consolations of form, of all the looms counting quiet mathematics into cloth, of all the old songs testing themselves against another unkind night and finding, against odds, the note they needed. Work was not denial. It was an answer. Before sleep, Lydia set one more small offering on the shrine. Not oil this time, but a clove of garlic, a gesture picked up from a neighbor born far from Attica, and now as Athenians as olives. For what we cannot see, she said. Theon murmured something like, Amen, and something like, tomorrow, the two sounding almost the same. Alexios touched the kiln door with 2 fingers, a soldier's benediction for a kiln he pretended was not a comrade. Diocles covered the wheel with a cloth that smelled faintly of clay and patience. Melina put her painted cup where the morning would find it and approve. Lamps dimmed. The floor gathered the day's dust and forgave it. Bodies settled into pallets with the gratitude of boats, making a harbor exactly at dusk. You lay under the thin blanket and let the house's heartbeat count yours down. The city outside had not spared itself. It had, however, kept its appointment with morning and delivered you to evening by honest means. Labor, small mercies, knowledge applied, fear shared, until it shrank by a thumb. Tomorrow would ask a fresh price. Tonight, the coin lay under the purse's flap, enough to cross a narrow bridge of sleep. In quiet endings, threads reach beyond time. Morning in Athens did not know that it was the last of your stay. It came as it always had, gently unfolding like a scroll under the hand of a careful scribe. The sun, patient and golden, crept over tiled rooftops, painting the Acropolis in light that seemed older than stone. A cock crowed somewhere far down the lane, answered by another nearer. Dogs stirred. Clay dust still clung to the air, faint as memory. Inside the potter's house, the rhythm was familiar. Lydia rose before the rest, pressing bread into shape with a steady palm. Melina hummed softly as she gathered wool for spinning, her voice a thread weaving comfort through the quiet. Alexios checked the kiln, fingers tapping its bricks with the ease of a man speaking a language only he and the fire shared. Diocles stretched his hands, knuckles cracking like twigs, then settled at the wheel. Theon, slower to rise but stronger now, leaned against the wall, his leg bound, but his eyes clear. The household, fragile yet resilient, moved as one. For you, each gesture carried new weight. You saw the ways people stitched life from threads so thin they might have snapped under a careless tug. And yet they held. Every loaf, every pot, every offering at the shrine was a reminder that survival was less a victory than a daily agreement. You remembered your first morning, the smoke that stung your lungs, the ache of water carried, the shock of streets littered with waste and noise. You remembered fear pressing against your ribs with every step. And now, after many days, the same streets seemed less hostile, not kinder perhaps, but known. A map etched into your senses, where to find the fountain that ran clearer, where the shade lingered longest, where a neighbor's greeting softened the air. That was the secret, perhaps. Not that Athens grew safer. The plague still crept, soldiers still fought, grain still came late. But that you had learned to move within its fabric, trusting its threads to bear your weight. At midday, Diocles prepared a delivery. 2 craters, wide-mouthed and strong, painted with vines that curled like the promise of growth. He looked at you with that plain gaze of his. "Carry one," he said, and in those 2 words lay more than an instruction. It was acknowledgement. that you had become, if not family, then at least part of the loom on which this household wove. The streets shimmered in the heat, but you carried the vessel steadily. Passers-by glanced at you, some nodding in recognition. You were no longer a stranger who stumbled. You were a figure in the city's daily weave, your steps anticipated by stone and shadow. When you returned, Lydia was setting figs on a plate. She handed you one, a rare sweetness, and smiled. "For the road," she said. Perhaps she meant the errand you had just completed. Perhaps she meant more. Evening came, as it always did, with lamps lit and shadows lengthening. The family gathered, their faces softened by firelight. Stories were shared, prayers whispered, hands busy with quiet tasks. Outside, Athens hummed on, the agora winding down, the Acropolis catching the last flame of the sun, voices rising and falling like the tide. And then came the stillness, not silence, but that deeper quiet that settles when a day has done its work. You lay upon your pallet, the same as your first night, but now the straw seemed less cruel, the shadows less sharp. Around you, breathing rose and fell in time with your own. You thought of how easily life in this place could break, and yet how, through ritual, through labor, through kindness exchanged across doorways, it endured. The question that had haunted you since waking in Athens, could a modern soul survive here? Softened. The answer was less about strength or knowledge, more about weaving yourself into the pattern. Alone, perhaps not. Together, perhaps enough. Your eyes grew heavy. Outside, the stars returned. The same stars that had watched these people, that watch you now. They asked for nothing but attention. In their company, the centuries between then and now dissolved, and as sleep drew you under, you felt the gentle tug of threads tying you to those who had lived, worked, prayed, and dreamed before you. Their lives, fragile yet unyielding, flowed forward into yours, and yours into the unknown beyond. The quiet loom of time. It is strange, isn't it, how a story lingers after its last chapter seems to have been turned. When the household of the potter has gone still, when the lamp is trimmed low, and when the dust of Athenian streets has settled again into the corners of memory, the tale itself keeps breathing, not loudly, not with the clamor of armies or the cry of heralds, but with the soft patience of threads drawn across a loom. Imagine yourself once more in that modest room, walls of clay pressed firm by calloused hands. The air holds the mingled scent of oil and ash. A spindle leans in its corner. A wheel rests covered with cloth, and the quiet confidence of tools waits for tomorrow's tasks. But tonight is for reflection. The journey through those days has been demanding. You carried water across streets uneven and unkind. You felt the ache of muscles asked to serve in ways modern life never prepared them for. You saw illness in its raw shape without the blessing of modern cures, and you glimpsed how fragile each step of survival truly was in a city pressed between war at its walls and sickness at its gates. Yet alongside hardship came something else, resilience stitched not from iron or grand decrees, but from smaller, humbler fibers. A woman who placed figs on a plate with care. A child whose steady hand painted vines onto clay. A soldier, limping, who still insisted he could work with his hands. A neighbor who passed herbs quietly through a doorway. These were the real pillars of Athens. Not the marble that still gleams in museums, but the living acts of endurance and kindness that held lives together. When we speak of ancient Greece, we often remember names inscribed in stone. Pericles, Sophocles, Socrates. they left ideas and monuments. But tonight, as you rest, it is right to think of the nameless many, those whose labor turned earth into bread, whose songs soothed fevers, whose simple prayers filled shrines with hope. Without them, the city would have been only walls and echoes. With them, it breathed. Close your eyes a little tighter now. Picture the streets by lamplight. Hear the distant murmur of a symposium, laughter muffled by thick walls. Beyond, a cough in the dark that reminds you of danger still present. And yet, within your chosen household, a steadier rhythm. The wheel's memory of clay, the ember's memory of flame, the bed's memory of rest. These simple memories cradle you. As the story folds into quiet, it leaves questions behind. Would you truly have survived in such a place? Perhaps not. The illnesses were merciless, the labor endless, the wars unrelenting. But survival is not always measured in years. Sometimes it is measured in the ability to share bread, to offer a hand steadying another's burden, to see beauty in painted vines. In those measures, perhaps you would have done well. Athens, in the end, was never only a city of philosophers and warriors. It was a city of households, each one a fragile fortress of trust, each one bound to neighbors through trade, gossip, prayer, and love. You have walked within one such house, sat by its fire, carried its water, shared its bread. In doing so, you have glimpsed the larger fabric, humanity, weaving itself together despite frayed edges. Now, as sleep draws nearer, let your breath slow. Inhale as if drawing in the faint smell of clay drying in the workshop. Exhale as if blowing dust gently from a newly painted pot. The night air is cool upon your face. The curtain moves as though stirred by a kindly hand. Outside, the stars are steady guardians, the same stars that bent over Athens long ago, the same that shine for you tonight. What remains when the voices fade and the lamps are extinguished? The continuity of human hope. It threads quietly through time, carrying with it the courage of those who endured narrow margins, who held to rituals and songs, who raised their children with the stubborn insistence that tomorrow was worth preparing for. Their resilience reaches you now, across centuries, not as noise but as hush, an inheritance of patience. Rest in that hush. Let it soften the body, calm the restless mind, and remind you that survival is never solitary. It is always shared, always carried by many hands. Tonight, those hands, ancient though they are, seem to cradle you too. So, let go. The wheel will spin again in another dawn, but for now, it rests. You too may rest. The faint crackle of a low fire, the breath of night through a narrow window. Even when voices fade, their days echo softly. When the story of Athens closes around you, it does not end in silence. Instead, it leaves a resonance, like a bell rung in a quiet valley, the sound continuing long after the strike. What lingers are not the shouts of the assembly or the distant clash of armies, but the quieter notes, the rasp of a potter's wheel, the murmur of prayers over a simple meal, the sigh of someone settling onto straw at the end of an unforgiving day. Let us return for a moment to the lanes of that ancient city. It is early morning, the kind of hour when dew still clings to olive leaves, and when the streets, though never empty, are softer in their stirrings. Vendors arrange their goods, olives glossy as stones, figs still clinging to sweetness, bread that hardens too quickly under the sun. Children chase each other with shrill laughter, though their bellies remind you of hunger. Slaves hurry, carrying water jars too large for their frames, and among them all, craftsmen open their shutters, dust falling into light. In that moment, life feels eternal. Disease may shadow the alleys, war may press at the walls, but the rhythms of daily survival continue. These were the true monuments of Athens, not the temples of marble that draw visitors centuries later, but the stubborn insistence of ordinary people to live another day, to laugh once more, to make something with their hands even when tomorrow was uncertain. Think again of Lydia, who tended both household and shrine. Her faith, woven into every gesture, was less about certainty than about courage. When she broke bread and set aside a piece for Hestia, she did not know whether the fire would burn safely through the night. She did not know whether sickness would spare her children, and yet she offered what she could, an act both humble and profound. Such faith in gods, in ritual, in love itself, has always been humanity's lantern in dark corridors. Melina, the child with quick hands and wide eyes, reminds us that resilience often begins young. Her laughter, even when shadowed by illness around her, was a defiance. She painted vines on clay, not because she believed the designs would stop the plague or hold back war, but because beauty itself was a kind of shield. In every era, children have carried such light. Fragile, yes, but bright enough to pierce fear. Theon, limping yet steadfast, carried stories instead of spears now. His voice gave shape to courage, telling how men endured long marches, how they leaned on one another when shields felt too heavy, how a song shared by firelight could keep despair from victory. He taught that survival was never the work of one, but always the bond of many. His stories echo even now, reminding us that though the forms of battle change, the need for solidarity remains constant. And Alexios, sharp-tongued but diligent, shows another truth. Skepticism does not cancel belief. He muttered against charms, rolled his eyes at ritual, yet he still whispered words to the kiln fire, still made his offerings at the shrine when night pressed too close. In that contradiction lay humanity's balance, doubt and devotion living side by side, each giving the other meaning. Diocles, the potter himself, embodied endurance without fanfare. His hands cracked and scarred, his back bent from years of labor. He asked for little but work well done and obligations met. In his wheels' steady turning, you could hear the heartbeat of Athens itself, unadorned, persistent, shaping clay into vessels that outlived their makers. Step back now from this single family. Picture the city as a living organism, each household a cell, each street a vein carrying voices, trade, and prayers. The agora throbbed like a heart, pulsing with transactions and rumors. The walls, high and strong, held everything inside, both safety and sickness, both wealth and want. Above it all, temples rose like the bones of a great body, pointing upward as if to remind mortals that their struggles were noticed, if not always spared. And still, the most enduring truth is not that Athens was extraordinary, but that it was human. Behind every name recorded in history were thousands forgotten, whose sweat laid the stones, whose laughter filled courtyards, whose tears watered the earth. Their days, though fragile, formed the ground upon which the great strides of civilization were made. Without their bread, the philosophers would not have debated. Without their pottery, symposia would not have glowed with wine. Without their devotion, the temples would have stood as empty shells. This is the echo that drifts toward us tonight. That history is not only what is carved into marble or inked onto papyrus, but what was whispered at bedside, sung to children, baked into loaves, carried in jars, shaped on wheels. It is soft, but it lasts. Now let your breath deepen. Imagine the dust of Athens settling slowly, turning gold in late sunlight. Hear the market closing, shutters pulled across stalls, feet shuffling homeward. Smell the faint tang of oil lamps being lit, smoke winding into corners. These are not the sounds of grand events, but of ordinary lives. And it is within the ordinary that the extraordinary endurance of humankind has always rested. Even as plague spread, even as fear tightened its grip, these people lived. They laughed, even softly. They prayed, even when prayers seemed unanswered. They touched hands in comfort, even when touch carried risk. They endured, not because they believed they would triumph forever, but because each day deserved to be met with dignity. This is what remains for us, not the certainty of safety, but the reassurance that endurance has always been possible. In every age, across every hardship, ordinary people like Lydia, Melina, Theon, Alexios, and Diocles, nameless to history's books, yet eternal in their quiet courage, carried forward the thread of human life. And tonight, as you rest, that thread is offered to you as well. Let it wrap gently around your thoughts. Let it remind you that though times change, the need for kindness, for beauty, for simple acts of survival remains constant. You are part of the same loom, woven into the same fabric. Their breath once fogged the night air, just as yours does now. Their stars shone then, just as yours shine above. So lie back. Feel the slow rhythm of your heart, as if it were the potter's wheel, turning steadily. Feel the rise and fall of your breath, as if it were waves upon the Piraeus shore. And let the echo of those lives, their labor, their laughter, their faith, cradle you into the gentlest of sleeps. Across centuries, the stars keep their gentle watch. Night has fallen again upon Athens. The lamps are dim, the chatter of the agora hushed, the last embers in the potter's kiln cooling into faint glow. The day, so crowded with errands, voices, burdens, and fears, folds into stillness. Yet above the city, the sky opens wide. It is here, in this darkness softened by starlight, that the truest conclusion waits. For while the stories of households and streets are fleeting, the stars remain, stitching together generations with their steady light. They shone upon Lydia as she set her offerings, upon Melina as she painted vines, upon Theon as he spoke of battles, upon Alexios as he whispered to fire, upon Diocles as he turned clay to form. And they shine upon you now, centuries later, without haste, without change. Step with me slowly onto the roof of the house. Imagine the cool clay beneath your feet, the faint rustle of laundry left to dry, the smell of smoke trailing into air. From here, the city stretches around you, walls heavy and enclosing, yet rooftops lifting into freedom. In one direction, the dark sea glimmers. In another, the hills rest like folded blankets. And above it all, the sky, vast, constant, familiar. What do these stars say? Not words of grandeur, not declarations of empire or philosophy, but something quieter. That human lives, however fragile, are part of a longer rhythm. That every jar carried, every loaf baked, every prayer whispered has meaning, because it joins the endless stream of existence. That the people of Athens, and you, and those yet unborn, are bound not by triumph or failure alone, but by this same light, this same cycle of day to night to day again. Let us think of the city one last time. The gates are closed, guarded. The soldiers sleep uneasily, their armor close by. Merchants lie upon mats, dreaming of full stalls tomorrow. Mothers curl around their children, guarding them even in sleep. Neighbors murmur goodnight across courtyards. Somewhere, a flute plays softly, its notes floating like moths toward the sky. And everywhere, in every house, the same longing that tomorrow will bring safety, enough food, another chance. This is the quiet truth of survival, not a dramatic victory, but the return of morning. Day after day, against every threat, they rose again. They carried water, they baked bread, they shaped clay, they honored gods, they endured. That endurance, humble and constant, is the gift they hand down to us across time. And now, after so many parts of their story, after so many moments shared in dim workshops and crowded streets, it is time to close the circle. But closing does not mean forgetting. Closing means carrying something forward, a lesson, a tenderness, an echo that steadies us even as sleep draws near. So, let the body sink deeper into rest. Feel the bed beneath you as if it were the straw pallet in that ancient house, scratchy yet honest. Hear the faint hum of night in your own room, as if it were the chorus of dogs and watchmen in Athens. Smell the faint memory of earth and oil carried by imagination. In these small sensations, you are still there, still woven into their world. And when morning comes, as it always does, you will rise not into Athens, but into your own life, carrying their resilience with you. The knowledge that even in times of hardship, there is beauty in ritual, strength in community, comfort in faith, and meaning in ordinary labor. These truths cross centuries like starlight crosses night, unhurried but enduring. Above you, the stars still burn, far older than Athens, far older than every name ever spoken. They are patient companions, reminding you that all human struggle is temporary, but all human kindness is eternal. Let that thought be your pillow tonight. Rest now. The city sleeps, the stars keep watch, and you are safe within their glow. Tomorrow will come gently, as it always has. Until then, close your eyes and let the long echo of Athens carry you into dreams.